So good afternoon, good morning, good evening, wherever you may be, and welcome to the launch of the second Global Cogeneration report published by COGEN World Coalition, CWC. To introduce myself, I'm the Executive Director of CWC, and we're very pleased to welcome everyone from around the world. We have over 100 registered participants, and we expect a good turnout this afternoon. Just some housekeeping. This session is being recorded, and will be made available on the CWC website after a couple of days, and all registered participants will receive a link to the video recording, but as well as the presentation. I'm very pleased to have Simon Minett from Challoch Energy, who will present the results of the second global report. But before we get to that, I'll turn over to Tom Smith, the CWC president, to give some introductory remarks. Tom?
Thank you, Hans. I'm glad you had the mute problem, because I just had it, so I got that out of the way. As all of you know, it's a really exciting time for our industry right now. We've been an industry for over 140 years, and CHP has played a major part in the electric power generation and thermal energy generation throughout the world. And it's sort of ironic. It's pretty early. I'm in Chicago, Illinois, and I'm actually heading on a trip later today. But my mission on my trip is heading out to California to work on a fairly large cogeneration project, and then also working on a large cogeneration project in Japan. So it sort of shows, the world nature of cogeneration and its impact. It's, again, as I mentioned, it's an exciting time. Here in the United States, we had a incentive called the Inflation Reduction Act that was passed, and it offered unprecedented incentives for combined heat and power. So we're seeing a lot of activity, going on right now in the industry. On the sort of interesting part, Hans had the ability to attend our annual summit in Washington, D.C. I'm also have the honor to be the president of that organization, and we had the largest attendance we ever had, and we've increased our membership dramatically. So, it definitely shows an interest in the CHP arena here in the United States. And on a global level, Hans and his team did a great job in finishing a paper, COP28, with the path to net zero, and how CHP can play a real integral part into that. It's a great technology in that we're super efficient. We have economic viability. We have resiliency and sustainability in our current format, in a lot of cases using, fossil fuels. But as we head to net zero with new fuels like hydrogen, RNG, biogas, and even carbon sequestration, to get to that net zero, CHP is really the most efficient technology out there, to utilize any form of fuel and turn it into usable energy. So again, pretty excited, again, being the president of both the CWC and the CHP and other regional organizations here in the United States. With that, I know it's going to be an interesting launch of the second Global Cogeneration Market Report that a lot of people put a lot of time in, and I'm super interested in hearing about that and looking to turn it over to Simon. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Tom. And now pleased to invite Simon Minett. He's the Managing Director of Challoch Energy, and he's largely responsible for the first global report and the second global report. So we're happy to welcome him back, and we're looking forward to hearing the results of the report. So I'll just turn it over to you, Simon. But as a reminder for everyone, if you have questions, do use the Q&A function on the Zoom platform. There will be a dedicated session to answer those questions in about 30 minutes. So the floor is yours, Simon.
Thank you, Hans. Thank you, Tom. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, depending on where you are in the world. As it was stated, I'm Simon Minett, the Managing Director of Challoch Energy, and we pulled together the second of the global CHP reports for the COGEN World Coalition. By way of introduction, so this is the second one. The methodology has been improved a little bit from the first one. but there's still quite some work to do, and I'll pick that up as we go through. Some regions are better than other regions in terms of data collection, data reporting, and data analysis. So the work is a summary of the the world data. The aim was to give an overview of the trends for global combined heat and power, and to see how each of these markets evolves. As I said, the first exercise was done back in 2022, and this sort of time last year we had the first of these webinars on this exercise. The work we use data principally from the IEA, the International Energy Agency, which reports in 2022. We haven't had any more data since 2022, and that's for a period between 1990 and 2020. And for Europe, we have Eurostat, which is the European Union's statistical body, and that reported in 2023, so not so long ago. It was in the beginning of the fall or the autumn of 2023, and that includes data up to 2021. So what we've done in the overall process is to report to 2020 to keep it all consistent. But for the European detail, we've given you 2021 data as well. It's important to raise a couple of issues. The first one is around about heat reporting and data completeness. So South America and Africa don't report any heat output data from cogen plants or CHP plants. And that's something I think over time we need to improve on. And then the second point, and the difference between IEA and Eurostat, and also between different countries' reporting processes, is the thorny issue is what is a CHP plant? When does it operate as a CHP plant? And when does it operate as not a CHP plant? I won't bore you with the details of that, but if you imagine a large power plant with a heat recovery facility, part of that plant's a CHP plant and the rest of it is not. Sometimes, especially in district heating, they can run just as power plants in, say, the summer months, and in the winter months they run as cogeneration plants. So it's quite a difficult thing. It's taken Europe 30 years to try and work out how to do that, and it still hasn't got it right. And you sort of feel sorry for the rest of the world because they have to go through the same process. Okay, so there's a few slides here. Let's start with the world overview, and then I'm going to do it region by region. The way I've done the regions for this presentation is I've done the region as a whole, and then I've taken the largest country within that region and presented the results from that. In many cases, that country dominates the statistics anyway, and you'll see that as we go through, that largest country is the significant player in that market. So for the world, electricity produced from CHP plants in 2020 was just over 4,000 terawatt hours. It has been growing slightly over time. So from 2010 to 2020, it's grown by around about 10%, 10 or 15%. But the share of the of CHP in the world market has declined, and that's partly because electricity production from other sources has grown faster than cogen plants. So you can see this curve here, the green curve on the lower graph, shows a slight decline of the share, though the total electricity output has grown from just over 20 million gigawatt hours in 2010 to about 27 million gigawatt hours in 2020. You can see that on the top graph here that CHP plants are dominated by heat output. Clearly, there's some caveat to that because some regions don't report heating, but they are relatively small in the total picture, so they don't distort the picture too much. So the heat output is about 2.5 to 3 times the electrical output in most plants, on a global scale, that is, with 10,000 gigawatt hours of heat and 4,000 gigawatt hours of electricity. Oh, gigawatts, sorry. These should be gigawatts, not gigawatt hours. My apologies. The fuel mix, the fuel mix is 98% of the fuel mix is made up of 3 fuels. So that's coal, natural gas, and biofuels and waste. Coal dominates that picture and has dominated that picture for the last decade, and at the moment shows no sign of declining. It's about 60% of the total fuel input to cogen plants is from coal. Natural gas is around 32%, so that's a third, and biofuels is around about 6%. And then the rest is whatever the balance is, which is very, very small. I guess the question is, as we go through the 2020s, we should start to see a decline in coal as the world transitions away from fossil fuels, to use the term used by the IEA, so that the COP28 communique. Future trends, we expect to fade out of coal, but so far it hasn't been evident. We see an electrification of industry and other sectors, so that may mean that there's a shrinkage of the cogen sector. We're starting to see a little bit of that in Europe at the moment, where electrification of heat is becoming more dominant. And then finally, we expect to see hydrogen-fueled CHP plants coming on stream. But at the moment, the economics are not quite there, and hydrogen is still an emerging fuel in many markets. There are 1 or 2 cogen plants around the world that now run on hydrogen. Notably, there's one in the Kobe harbor area in Japan, which is 100% hydrogen. Okay, so for Europe, the data is pretty complete. The data sources we've used are the IEA and Eurostat for Europe, and we have a few slides on this. So Europe, around about 700 terawatt hours of electricity comes from cogen plants. Cogen is a significant supplier of electricity and heat into the markets, with here it says 20% of the electricity share. We'll come back to why that's 20% and not what Cogen Europe says, because it's a question between total CHP and high efficiency cogeneration, which is a specific legal definition within European legislation. So there's more cogeneration than there is high efficiency cogeneration, as you'd expect. The fuel mix in Europe is dominated by natural gas, with coal in decline and biofuels in a growth scenario. The others are very minor nuclear and oil products. And we would expect to see this continue, with natural gas starting to also decline as renewable fuels, and we should then add hydrogen into this, grow in importance. Renewable fuels in Europe have increased dramatically over the last 10 years. Turning now to the European Union, so the 27 member countries, you can see that the share is a little bit lower because now we've excluded Norway, we've excluded the United Kingdom and Switzerland from this mix. It's just the European Union. And you can see that this data also reports to 2021. So this is Eurostat data as opposed to IEA data. And the European market is dominated by 3 countries: Germany with 31% of all CHP electricity output, Poland with 20%, and Italy with 13%. And then the others form the rest of it, which is the just over 1/3 of everything else is the other 24 countries in Europe, with Spain, the Czech Republic, Finland, Austria, France, and Belgium, Denmark being sort of the biggest players in that, and no CHP in Malta, which is a small economy and never had any tradition of CHP. CHP in Europe faces many challenges. The legal framework within the European Union is immensely complicated, massively overlapping, confusing at times, to be perfectly honest. And there is a very significant shift towards zero emissions and a focus on electrification of all sectors of the economy. So that's both heat and transportation, as well as power, of course. And significant pressure on CO2 emissions. So CHP has a little bit more of a challenge in Europe than it may do in other parts of the world. You can see that the electrical output from CHP has, from 2017 up to 2018, grew. Then it shrunk back in 2019 and 2020. It's partly due to COVID, impacts of COVID, especially in 2020. And we're back up towards 2019 levels at the moment in 2021, which is there's still some influence of the COVID pandemic within 2021. Looking at the split between fuels, I mentioned earlier that the two data sources, so the IEA and Eurostat, are slightly different, and the legal basis for supporting cogeneration in Europe is based on high efficiency cogeneration. So that has a set of definitions, and we won't go into that today, but maybe for another time. And you can see there that the vast majority of plants, so well over 80% of all plants in Europe, operate in high efficiency mode. And there's about 11% or so of plants above that, which are not high efficient CHP plants. In terms of number of units, we're looking at around about 16,000 units installed, dominated by internal combustion engines, so mostly gas engines. But if I flip this towards capacity of installations, then gas turbines, combined cycles, and steam turbines would start to get a much larger share, and and internal combustion engines would shrink because internal combustion engines are mostly small-scale plants, and the other ones which are installed in industry are other large-scale plants. Focusing on the largest country in Europe, Germany. Germany has been the biggest market for CHP for as long as we've ever been collecting statistics in Europe. It's clearly the largest country in Europe as well. And CHP has been broadly stable over the last so many years in terms of output. A little bit of a dip caused by COVID, of course. And what you can see here is that the fuel mix, coal has declined dramatically in the last 10 years. Natural gas has been fairly stable, and biofuels have grown. So Germany mirrors the trend in Europe as a whole, that coal is declining and renewable fuels are growing. And at the moment, natural gas is a fairly stable share of total. And then there's little bits like solar and wind, not really wind, but solar thermal going into cogen plants, but it's tiny amounts. Okay, so that's Europe. Turning now to North America. The data completeness is also good in North America. And these sources are the IEA and the CHPA in the US also collects data, but we use the IEA data for comparative reasons. Total amount of electricity produced by CHP in North America is 333 terawatt hours in 2020, and it's dominated by natural gas, with small amounts of coal, small amounts of renewables, and the natural gas share has been growing substantially, so up from below 70% to nearly 80% of all fuels going into cogen plants in North America comes from natural gas at the present time. In terms of output and heat output, it's fairly it's a fairly chaotic picture in some ways. If you look at the green curve in the top graph there, share of CHP electricity has wobbled around. Okay, the scale on the right side is relatively small in terms of its output, but there are some good years, and then there's some bad years, and then there's some good years again. So we don't really know why that's the case. But when you see the graph in a moment on the next slide, that's dominated by the United States. So it's a dynamic within the US market. Largest country in North America. I mean, clearly there's not many countries in North America anyway. But the US is well over 90% of the total market, with 300 terawatt hours of electricity produced from cogen plants. And again, you can see that sort of share of CHP electricity curve in the top graph there being mirroring the one we saw for North America as a whole. So it is a US phenomenon. Fuel mix very similar to the total, of course, with natural gas filling up, almost 80% of the total fuel share in this region. Turning now to other regions of the world, so we have Central and South America. Data completeness is less good in this region. Again, we're using the source of IEA. Total electricity production is only 91 terawatt hours, so substantially lower than either the EU or either Europe or North America. You can also see in the top graph here there is no heat data. Heat data is not reported and possibly not collected in some countries. So it's difficult to know what the heat output of these plants would be. But what you can see is on the bottom graph is the dominant fuel in this region is biofuels and waste. Most of this is sugar, or a large proportion of it is sugar, so that's a steam cycle. So you'd expect the heat output to be substantially greater than the power output for this region, but we don't know that statistically. There's a reasonable amount of natural gas, a little bit of coal, and a little bit of oil, but it's dominated by renewable fuels, and has been growing steadily from 2020 through to 2020, from 2010 through to 2020. Interestingly, a couple of months ago, I attended a seminar organized by Argentina, which traditionally has not done very much on cogen, where there's a cogen initiative going on in Argentina now. So there is some movement across the continent here for an increase in cogeneration. Brazil dominates this market. Again, it's sort of 90% Brazil and 10% everybody else. Not surprisingly, most of the fuel going into cogen plants is biofuels. It's dominated by the sugar industry in Brazil, but there's other renewable fuels going in as well from other forest and agricultural products or byproducts. Share has grown steadily and is now about 12% of all Brazilian electricity comes from cogen plants. So it's comparable to the share in both North America and the EU. Turning now to Asia, this includes Australia, New Zealand, and Oceania. So it's a very, very large region, but population-wise and also geographically, it's huge. Data completeness is not bad for this area, and again, the IEA has been the main source of data. Total electricity produced from CHP plants is 3,000 terawatt hours, so that's sort of comparable to substantially more than any other market, in fact. So EU is about 700 terawatt hours. North America is about 300 terawatt hours. So this is 3 times those two markets put together. China is dominant, as we'll see in a moment. And coal is the dominant fuel for this market, partly because China dominates the process. A little bit of natural gas, mostly outside China, and some very small amounts of biofuels, which is in countries like Thailand and Malaysia and Philippines and things like that. The total share of electricity from CHP has been declining, and that partly reflects the fact that the power demands in this region have grown dramatically, and COGEN has not kept pace with the total amount of power generation. So it's declined from around about 18% to around about 16, just over 16% in this decade. As I said, China dominates the market. In fact, China is 75% of the market. And as you can see here, in the share of coal in that market is effectively 100%. It's very close to 100% in 2010, and it's sort of 95% or a bit more than 95% in 2020. So coal is a very dominant fuel, given the fact that 2,000 terawatt hours comes from China. You can sort of see why coal is the dominant fuel worldwide for cogen plants at the moment. And you can see here that the electricity production is about 2.5 times less than the heat production. So these are good quality CHP plants. Finally, Africa. So the data is very incomplete. It's very sporadic. Some countries report a bit, some countries don't report at all. So it's the area which probably requires the most work in terms of data completeness. It's a very small market as well at the moment. That partly reflects the fact that the data capture is less good, so we're not necessarily getting all the data, but only 1 terawatt hour of electricity from CHP plants in 2019. This is not even 2020 data, and it's a tiny share. And again, declining use of biofuels, increasing use of natural gas, and almost no coal in this market. We haven't done a single country for this one because there wasn't anything that was really good enough quality to report further. So there's just the Africa overview. The one region we haven't reported on for political reasons is Russia and its and the republics around Russia. And that's something we perhaps should think about next year, not necessarily Russia, but some of the republics around which weren't included in any of this analysis. Kazakhstan and Ukraine and other places are not included in this statistical overview. Okay, final part of this presentation, just some current and future trends in the market. The current situation, we see Asia Pacific growing fast and Europe and North America being a bit more stable or stagnant. Given what Tom was saying earlier about the movement in the US, maybe when we report this next year, we'll start to see some of that kick up of activity in the US feeding through. But for Europe, we expect sort of more of the same. It's like fairly stable in most countries, and a slight decline in one or two, and a move from fossil fuels towards renewable fuels is likely to continue in Europe. Technologies at the moment in these markets is dominated in terms of capacity by gas engines and steam turbines, gas turbines and steam turbines. In terms of numbers, then, as I said earlier, there's an awful lot of internal combustion engines or gas engines in there, but they're generally smaller technologies. So you have a lot of those to make up one of the other technologies. Fuel-wise, coal and natural gas are the dominant fuels, and biofuels and waste are still small. Large capacity units dominate the market, and they're mostly in industrial plants, or large or district heating plants, especially in Europe. In the northern part of Europe, district heating plants can be quite substantial in terms of size, but the industrial sector, then that's refineries, chemical plants, pulp and paper, etc., etc. Those sort of sectors have the lion's share of capacity. In Europe, it's about 50-50 between industry and district heating in terms of share. In other markets, it's industry predominates. Looking to the future, and crystal ball's always dangerous, of course. In terms of geography, we expect growth still to come from the Asian market, possibly growth also in South America, especially with some of the initiatives that are going on down there. And I think, I might reflect on the last point here, that North America will continue to see CHP role diminish. I think that's probably not correct, and we might need to just revise that based on what we heard from the president earlier. Technologies, so some emerging technologies like fuel cells are still struggling through in this market, and I think what we'll start to see is the rise of technologies that can cope with the new fuels that come in. So some of the e-fuels, if to use that expression, be it hydrogen or synthetic fuels. In terms of fuels, the climate change processes, enshrined by COP28, probably starts to see some pressure on coal and natural gas used in cogen plants as well as other power plants, of course. How quickly that will happen is still to be debated, and in some markets, I suspect we'll still see some growth of those until a certain point. Europe, I would expect to see a slightly faster trend in that process. Most of the size will continue to be large scale, though increasing numbers of small scale decentralized units in perhaps in microgrids, and that's perhaps a trend for sort of more rural areas in Africa and elsewhere. And then in terms of end users, no, we don't see much change, increase perhaps in commercial and residential CHP installations, but industry will still dominate. Ladies and gentlemen, that's the end of the presentation, and then we can take any questions people may have. Hans, back over to you.
Thank you, Simon. Excellent presentation, very interesting, a lot of data there. Some interesting trends as well. For completeness, you mentioned Ukraine, and I just happened upon some interesting statistics that came out regarding Ukraine. This is a fairly significant market. It has 60 gigawatts of installed power capacity, although about 20% of that's been destroyed, mainly coming from natural gas as a primary fuel, just out of interest. So an interesting market in terms of Europe. So we've got some questions coming in already, so thank you for that. We appreciate that. You mentioned you wouldn't go into it, Simon, but someone would like to know more about how one defines high efficiency CHP in Europe.
Okay, so we can certainly refer them to the appendices within the Energy Efficiency Directive, which gives the methodology. But in a nutshell, a cogen plant is compared against the alternative production both of heat and of electricity, and then it's based on the different types of fuels. So fossil fuels are compared against a natural gas power plant and a natural gas boiler, and all the other fuels are compared against burning those fuels in separate production. So, for example, if you've got a gas-fired combined heat and power plant, you are compared against a combined cycle plant, which is an operational combined cycle plant, and that's done by data gathering. And the efficiency of those at the moment is 53% on average for the technology that's sort of current. In operation, that is, it's not manufacturer's design, and your heat is compared against a boiler, and that boiler would have an efficiency of 90%. And so you take the output of the CHP and compare it against the two, and to be high efficiency, you have to be 10% better than those two separate productions. And if you're not, then there's a scaling back process. So part of your cycle will be high efficiency, but the rest of it won't be. And then the only other thing to mention in that process is for electricity production, temperature is important in terms of the average ambient temperature, the air temperature. So the higher the temperature, the lower the efficiency of your power plant. If it's a gas turbine, that is, and that's the alternative in the power market. So there's a temperature correction, and if you're connected at low voltages, then there's a correction for the losses in the power network. So right down the bottom of the system at domestic level or residential level, then the correction is 14% for grid losses. If you're connected at very high voltage, then the correction would only be 1 or 2%, and it's a sliding scale, and it depends on the level you're connected. It's an awful lot more complicated than that, of course, because then we have what is a cogen plant. What elements of your cycle are counted as cogen. So things like backup boilers are not included. If you've got steam turbines that run without heat recovery because they're doing drive functions within, say, oil refineries, those are not included as cogen plants. So it's very, very dependent, and it's quite complex process. And for anybody who's interested, there's about 120-page manual to read through for that. But the overall concept is easy. It's the delivery of that concept is more complex.
Thank you, Simon. And if people are interested, you can reach out to COGEN Europe specifically, and we can point you in the right direction to all the documentation, and you can get into the more technical details there. Just maybe sticking to Europe, I don't know if you can, Simon, very quickly just repeat the data for Europe. I guess the Eurostat data is probably more accurate. If you want to share that particular slide, and then also linked to Europe was, I guess, a question regarding the impression of the situation today in Europe in terms of natural gas applications in Europe, and more specifically Germany.
Okay, so this is the overall for EU 27. So this is is Europe as a whole, which includes the United Kingdom, Switzerland, Norway. It's 700 terawatt hours in total. This is based on IEA data. And then this is the EU 27 where Eurostat applies. So this is based on Eurostat data. Eurostat doesn't collect data for Norway, Switzerland, and doesn't any longer connect data for the United Kingdom after it left the EU a couple of years ago, formally left the EU a couple of years ago. So this is 682 terawatt hours. So the difference is mostly the United Kingdom between these two. Hans, what was the question on this data?
No, it was just a question regarding the impression of the situation today. Well, what is the situation today in terms of natural gas in the EU and in Germany?
Right. So natural gas. So in the EU as a whole, there is, and there has been for the last 6 or 7 years, a very strong push towards reducing the amount of fossil fuels in the energy mixes in total, and of course cogen's within that picture. Over the last 4 or 5 years, we've had legislation come through which is called the Green Deal, and then the Fit for 55 packages. Hans will know an awful lot about this because he's been in the mix of that, and it's a very complex set of interlocking and sometimes conflicting legislation. And there is within that process, any new investments will not be allowed now with coal or oil if you're seeking any support from public bodies, but natural gas is allowed to continue to be included as long as you reach thresholds for CO2 emissions. And that's until, and here, this is where the conflict is at the moment, either 2025, 2030 or 2034, depending on which package you're looking at. So it's a complicated story. The general trend is to encourage the use of renewables. So even biomass renewables are under some scrutiny in terms of the sustainability criteria for biofuels. And then finally, we would expect to see hydrogen and principally green hydrogen in that mix starting to take a more prominent role as we go forward and replacing natural gas. Though exactly how fast that will happen, there can be a long discussion on that. To be honest, it's not clear exactly which sectors it will go into first, how it will be delivered, etc., etc. There's still a lot of questions to be answered.
Thank you, Simon. You mentioned Argentina in your presentation, a new CHP scheme in Argentina. Do you have any more details that you could share based on your contribution to that discussion webinar?
So it's sort of like a project at the moment. So it's a project between Argentinian ministries and industry and the European Union. So and it's the process is to transfer know-how and experience into Argentina, which doesn't have a long tradition of cogeneration. So that's not just technology, it's also legislative, it's support regimes and things like that. I think the amount of cogen in Argentina is really very small at the moment. But there is a focus that it makes some sense for them to do it. And so they're having a good look. I think it's still early days. I know they started the process about 6 months ago, or a little bit more than that maybe now. And I spoke at one of their seminars in September, I think it was. But I was doing it like this. So they were all in a room and I was sitting behind a camera. So I didn't see the rest of the meeting, but there was a lot of questions for what was presented. I think we can watch this space, but there's plenty of potential in Argentina in the industrial sector.
Okay, thank you, Simon. Going to one of our first questions, perhaps you can try to answer this as well. How do you see market growth in CAGR for the next 5 years in North America and Europe?
I think I'm going to answer it in the opposite way. I see Europe being stable in that there won't be too much growth in that market. It'll be maintaining the current fleet and replacing the fleet as it wears out. Some countries are more supportive of cogen than other countries. So I think it will depend where we can see some growth in Germany, perhaps, but maybe less in somewhere like the Netherlands. In terms of North America, then, when we did the analysis, we didn't see any trends in the data that showed any substantial growth or any significant growth. But, given the IRA process has been ongoing, and what Tom said earlier, then I think we can probably start to see growth there. In terms of what that would be in terms of compound growth, I don't know, to be honest. I think that I don't have that crystal ball.
No, I think it's a fair point for Europe, and as Simon said, there's going to be just maintaining the market share in Europe. If you look at countries like Poland, which relies heavily on coal, they're shifting away from coal to natural gas, but basically maintaining the same installed capacity, just going for a lower emission fuel in the future.
And Hans, that was a big stimulus for the cogen industry in Europe back in the early 1990s, when a legislative process came in called the Large Combustion Plant Directive, which forced the closure of old polluting plants, which provided a stimulus. So I think in Central Europe, especially, the markets are dominated by coal. So Poland, Czech Republic, Slovakia, then you could see that being a bit of a stimulus for cogen in those markets. I think it's harder to see substantial growth in somewhere like Spain or the Netherlands or France.
Well, this is for another organization, but for those of you who are interested in trends that are related to Europe, COGEN Europe will be publishing its national snapshot survey, the high-level results in Q1 next year. So you'll have a more detailed overview looking at the different trends over the many different years. It's basically based on a survey that we ask our national associations and partners, and we look at the trends. So it's always the same questions, and we look at the trends, and then we compound that with the statistics from Eurostat that Simon just presented. So look out for that as well. Let's see, a few more questions have popped in. I think that CHP plants based on natural gas will still be needed for the energy transition in Europe for at least the next 10 years. Do you agree? Or what do you think?
Absolutely. If you look at the situation at the moment in the electricity sector, then about 40% of electricity now comes from zero carbon sources. But not all the time, of course. Sometimes there's more and sometimes there's less, because wind and solar dominate those markets. And in Europe, we have a system where the weather sometimes is very cold, very still and foggy. A Donkelfluter, it's called. And that can last 4 or 5 days, where you have no renewable generation from those sources. So you need thermal generation in that process to back it up. I think we're at a bit of a turning point now, where actually a bit more realism might come into the European thinking that electrification is not the only answer, and you need other things, and then you need to decarbonize the fuel sector as well as the electricity sector, because you need that backup power. You need power to run industry. You need power for the district heating schemes. but not in the way perhaps 30 years ago you need it. You need it in a slightly different way now. But I see natural gas being there as the sort of the only fossil fuel left, if you like, for a bit, and then transitioning from natural gas to hydrogen has to come from the network first. But I see that happening as well, because I don't see too much alternative. But I'm sure plenty of people will disagree with me.
No, it's a fair point, and natural gas will still be a backbone of Europe's energy system for quite some time. There was a final question, but I guess it's more of the way the data was presented in the EU27. The Netherlands was not mentioned, and why? But I guess it's just a condensation of the charts. The Netherlands is still part of the EU27, and it is still a significant market for CHP.
I realised that slide, which is slide 8, which adds the three main markets for Germany, Poland, Italy, and then the rest. The Netherlands is not part of that, so that's a fair point. And I apologise for missing it out. We can certainly add the Netherlands into that graph.
We're not supporting Nexit. All right, then. I think that's really all the questions and all the time we have today. We only have a few more minutes before the turn of the hour. So thank you very much again to Simon Minett from Challoch Energy. Appreciate his insights and presenting the data. And we're looking forward to continuing to follow these trends. And we'll come out with the third market report towards the end of next year. And we'll see, in particular in markets like the US, where the IRA may or may not have an impact on the statistics that we'll see, and possibly as well in Europe in terms of what's happened with the energy crisis, and those trends as well will start to trickle in terms of the statistics that are made available to us. So should be very interesting. Just as a reminder to everyone, this is being recorded, so you can re-review everything, and we will also make the slides available on the CWC website in a few days' time. And this will be our last webinar for CWC. We will begin again next year, both looking at different markets from around the world, but also then focusing on different technologies, as we've done this year, focusing on district heating and cooling, looking at industrial CHP. Next year, we'll be looking at different technologies as well. Fuel cells, for example, and different applications of CHP, different fuels, and so forth. So a lot of materials being planned for next year, so do look out for that. And we're looking to welcome you all to our global webinars. With that said, wishing everyone a good holiday period, and wishing you all the best in 2024, and looking forward to reconnecting to everyone to continue this discussion on CHP and its role in terms of meeting the goal of net zero by 2050. So thank you again to Simon Minett, and thank you again to our president for joining us, and thank you to everyone who's joined from around the world. So looking forward to connecting again next year.
Hey, Hans, one closing remark. I want to give thanks to you for all your efforts this year. I know it's been a challenging time, and it was great catching up with you in DC earlier, in November. And Simon, excellent job. But one of the important main closing remarks, and as the president, I know Hans sometimes doesn't bring this up, but it's super important that we get our membership going with CWC. So if anybody's interested, you can see all the great work we do. And as Simon mentioned, there's plenty of headwinds there for us. And a lot of it is just getting, people educated on the benefits of CHP, some of the things that we did here in the US, and it's an ongoing process. So if there's an interest level, please reach out to Hans or myself or anybody. Again, thanks everybody, and have a great holiday and a great new year.
Thank you, Tom. Thank you, everyone. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.